money doesn't just disappear. When fortunes change hands, when entire generations pass their accumulated wealth to the next, something fundamental shifts in how society works, how power flows, and who controls the future. Right now, in the middle of the 2020s, we're watching the largest transfer of wealth in human history unfold in real time. Over the next 25 years, $124 trillion will move from one generation to another. That's not a typo. 124 trillion. To put that in perspective, the entire economy of the United States, the largest economy on Earth, produces about $27 trillion worth of goods and services in a single year. This wealth transfer is more than 4 times that amount. It's 3 times the size of the global economy, and it's happening now. But here's what makes this moment different from every other wealth transfer in history. It's not just the size. It's the timing, the structure, and the fact that most people receiving this wealth have no idea it's coming. Research from Cerulli Associates, published in 2024, breaks down exactly where this money is going and when it will arrive. $105 trillion will flow to heirs, children, and grandchildren of the baby boomer generation and their parents. $18 trillion will go to charitable organizations. Nearly $100 trillion of this total will come from baby boomers and older Americans, representing 81% of all transfers. The silent generation, those born before 1946, will contribute the rest. The baby boomers are the wealthiest generation ever to live. They currently control 51.8% of all wealth in the United States, worth approximately $78 trillion. They make up about 20% of the population, but hold more than half the nation's assets. They benefited from decades of economic expansion, rising home prices, booming stock markets, and employer pension plans that no longer exist for younger workers. They bought houses when they cost what a car costs today. They invested in stocks when the Dow Jones was a fraction of current levels. And now, as they age into their 70s and 80s, all of that accumulated wealth is about to change hands. The year 2025 marks what demographers call peak 65. Every single day this year, approximately 11,400 Americans turn 65 years old. That's over 4 million people reaching traditional retirement age in a single year, the highest number ever recorded in American history. This surge continues through 2027. By 2030, every single baby boomer will be 65 or older. The wave has arrived, but wealth transfers don't follow simple patterns. The money doesn't just flow straight down from parents to children in neat, predictable streams. The structure is more complex, more layered, and frankly, more unequal than most people realize. Cerulli's research identifies 2 distinct phases of this transfer. The first phase is horizontal, meaning wealth moves between people of the same generation before it moves to the next. Spouses inherit from spouses. Widows receive assets from deceased husbands. About $54 trillion will transfer horizontally before eventually moving to younger generations. And here's a critical detail. Nearly $40 trillion of these horizontal transfers will go to widowed women in the baby boomer and older generations. Women live longer than men on average. In the United States, women's life expectancy is approximately 80.7 years compared to 76.3 for men. In Switzerland, it's 85.1 for women versus 81.8 for men. In Japan, women average 86.9 years, while men average 81.5. This longevity gap, combined with the tendency for women to marry slightly older men, means that in the vast majority of marriages, the wife survives the husband. When that happens, the family's accumulated wealth transfers horizontally to the surviving spouse. Over 28 million women will become the primary wealth managers for their families as they outlive their partners. The average transfer between spouses is approximately $1.4 million. This horizontal movement matters because it delays the intergenerational transfer. The money sits with the surviving parent for another 10, 15, maybe 20 years before their children inherit. During that time, the wealth can grow through investment returns or shrink through spending and healthcare costs. It can be managed well or poorly. And critically, the surviving spouse makes all the decisions about how much gets passed down and to whom. After the horizontal transfers, the money eventually flows to the next generation, but not equally. Millennials, those born between the early 1980s and mid-1990s, will inherit the largest share. Over the next 25 years, $46 trillion will transfer to millennials. Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980, will receive $39 trillion. Even Generation Z, the youngest cohort, will inherit $15 trillion. But the timing differs significantly. Over the next 10 years specifically, Gen X will receive $14 trillion, while millennials get only $8 trillion. Gen X is hitting the prime inheritance age right now, in their 50s and early 60s, when their boomer parents are dying or entering end-of-life planning. Millennials, currently in their 30s and early 40s, will have to wait longer for their larger inheritance. Their parents, the younger baby boomers, are still alive and often still working. The wealth won't transfer for another decade or two in many cases. This timing matters enormously for financial planning, debt management, and life decisions. A Gen X person receiving a substantial inheritance at age 55 can use it very differently than a millennial receiving the same amount at age 65. Now let's talk about who actually receives this wealth, because here's where the inequality becomes stark. Research consistently shows that wealthy families account for a disproportionate share of all transfers. High net worth and ultra-high net worth households, meaning those with significant investable assets, make up only 2% of all American households, but they will account for more than 50% of the total transfer volume. $62 trillion will come from just 2% of families. The wealthiest 10% of households will give and receive the vast majority of all transferred wealth. The top 1% holds about as much wealth as the bottom 90% combined. This concentration creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Wealthy families pass wealth to their children, who become wealthy adults, who pass even more wealth to their children. Studies using data from the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, which has tracked American families for nearly half a century, show that a 1 decile increase in parents' wealth position associates with an increase of about 4 percentiles in their offspring's wealth position in adulthood. Even more striking, grandparental wealth predicts grandchildren's wealth independent of parental wealth. The advantages accumulate across multiple generations. And it's not just direct inheritance. Family wealth advantages begin much earlier in life through investments in education, help with home purchases, business startup capital, and access to professional networks. Research shows that most of the advantages arising from family wealth actually accrue from investments that begin in childhood and early adulthood, not from late life bequests. By the time someone inherits money in their 50s or 60s, their life trajectory has already been shaped by decades of family financial support or lack thereof. Consider education. Wealthy families pay for private schools, tutoring, test preparation, college tuition, and graduate degrees without requiring their children to take on debt. A child graduating from college without student loans starts their working life with a massive advantage over someone carrying $50,000, $80,000, or $100,000 in debt. The debt-free graduate can save for a home down payment, invest in retirement accounts, or take career risks that the indebted graduate cannot. Over a lifetime, that initial advantage compounds into hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars of difference in accumulated wealth. The same pattern repeats with homeownership. Parents with wealth help their children buy first homes through down payment assistance or co-signing mortgages. In expensive markets like London or major American cities, researchers found that first-time homeowners who received family financial help reconcile their good fortune with meritocratic beliefs by downplaying the assistance, calling it just a little help from parents. But that little help often makes the difference between owning a home or renting for life. And home equity represents the single largest source of wealth for most middle-class families. Business ownership follows the same pattern. Wealthy families provide seed capital, loans, and connections that enable their children to start businesses. They offer a financial safety net that allows taking entrepreneurial risks without fear of personal bankruptcy. They provide introductions to clients, investors, and partners. The child of wealth who starts a business has fundamentally different odds of success than someone without family backing. Even marriage patterns reinforce wealth concentration. People tend to marry others from similar economic backgrounds. The child of wealthy parents is more likely to attend elite universities, work in high-paying industries, and socialize in circles where they meet other children of wealth. When wealthy people marry wealthy people, their combined assets create even larger fortunes to pass to the next generation. Research shows this assortative mating by wealth class has increased over recent decades, meaning the wealthy are increasingly marrying each other rather than partnering across economic lines. The racial dimensions of this wealth transfer cannot be ignored. Federal Reserve research shows that 88% of inheritance recipients are white. The typical white family has 8 times the wealth of the typical black family and 5 times the wealth of the typical Hispanic family. This disparity traces back through generations of discriminatory policies, from slavery to Jim Crow, to redlining to unequal access to education and employment. Inheritance perpetuates these historical inequalities by transmitting wealth accumulated under unjust systems forward through time. Most inheritances are relatively modest. According to Federal Reserve data, the majority of transfers are for less than $50,000. Only about 2% of inheritances exceed $1 million. But when you look at total dollar amounts rather than number of transactions, the picture flips. Those million-dollar-plus transfers, despite being just 2% of the count, account for 40% of all dollars transferred. Gift transfers among living people show even more extreme concentration. The wealthy don't just inherit more, they also give more to their children while still alive. The strategy of giving while living has become increasingly popular among wealthy boomers. Current tax law allows individuals to give up to $18,000 per year to any number of recipients without triggering gift taxes. A couple can give $36,000 annually. Wealthy parents use this to transfer substantial wealth while avoiding estate taxes and while seeing their children benefit from the money. Over a decade, a couple can gift more than $300,000 to a single child without any tax consequences. Multiply that across multiple children, and the lifetime transfers add up to millions before the parents even die. This strategy also allows parents to maintain control. They can attach conditions to gifts, watch how their children use the money, and adjust future giving based on behavior. The psychology of wealth transfer reveals that many wealthy parents worry about spoiling their children or destroying their work ethic with too much money too soon. So they create trusts with restrictions on access. They provide funds only for specific purposes like education or home purchase, and they structure their estates to support multiple generations rather than dumping everything on their immediate children. Family offices and wealth managers have built entire practices around helping the wealthy navigate these transfers. They design multi-generational trusts, establish family governance structures, facilitate family meetings to discuss money, and educate heirs about financial management. Wealthy families treat wealth preservation as a professional endeavor requiring expert guidance. Research interviewing first-generation wealthy parents and their wealth managers reveals a pedagogy of inherited wealth, a careful teaching of how to think about, manage, and perpetuate family fortunes across generations. But most American families don't have access to family offices or estate planning attorneys. They don't create sophisticated trusts or hold formal family meetings about wealth transfer. For the middle class, inheritance often happens informally and reactively. A parent dies, the estate gets divided according to a simple will or state intestacy law, and the children receive whatever remains after debts and taxes. There's little planning, little education, and often significant family conflict over who gets what. The timing of when people typically receive inheritances has shifted dramatically over the past century. Historically, people inherited relatively young, in their 20s or 30s, when their parents died at younger ages. Life expectancy in 1900 was about 47 years. By 1950, it had climbed to 68. Today, it exceeds 78. The parents of today's inheritors are living into their 80s and 90s, meaning their children don't inherit until their own 50s, 60s, or even 70s. This delay changes the impact of inherited wealth. A 30-year-old inheriting $50,000 can invest it for retirement or use it to buy a home. A 65-year-old inheriting the same amount might use it to supplement retirement income or pass it to their own children. The later inheritance provides less time for compound growth and less ability to fundamentally change the recipient's life trajectory. There's also a stark divide in baby boomer financial readiness for retirement that affects how much they'll have to pass down. While boomers as a generation are the wealthiest in history, that wealth is highly concentrated. More than half, 52.5%, of boomers turning 65 between 2024 and 2030 have assets of $250,000 or less. Another 14.6% have assets of $500,000 or less. Nearly two-thirds will struggle to maintain their standard of living in retirement, meaning they'll spend down their assets rather than accumulating wealth to pass on. Only about 10% of baby boomers are fully retired despite being eligible for Social Security. Financial concerns keep many working past traditional retirement age. Nearly 1 in 5 boomers worry they won't have sufficient savings to cover basic living expenses in retirement. The Consumer Price Index for those aged 62 and older increased 3.1% in January 2025 compared to the previous year, eroding purchasing power for those on fixed incomes. Many boomers who expected to leave substantial inheritances may end up spending most of their wealth on health care, assisted living, or nursing home care in their final years. Long-term care costs are particularly devastating to estates. According to recent data, a year in an assisted living community averages $72,924. A nursing home averages $131,583 annually. Projected to 2030, those costs will reach $84,539 and $152,540 respectively. A boomer who spends 5 years in a nursing home at these rates will consume $600,000 to $700,000 of assets. That wipes out most middle-class estates entirely. The gap between expected and actual inheritance has created disappointment for some younger adults. Surveys show that 32% of millennials expect to receive an inheritance, while only 22% of baby boomers actually plan to leave one. This expectation mismatch sets up potential conflict and financial miscalculation. Young people planning their finances around an inheritance that never materializes face serious problems. Part of this gap comes from the three-generation curse, an old saying that goes from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The idea is that the first generation builds wealth through hard work, the second generation maintains it, and the third generation squanders it. Research on generational wealth confirms this pattern is common. A mathematical model examining whether affluent families can perpetuate wealth across 5 generations found that only 43% of families starting with $1 billion maintained or grew that wealth through 5 generations, roughly 120 years. The other 57% saw the wealth dissipate through some combination of too many heirs splitting the estate, excessive spending, divorces, poor investment returns, and high taxes. The variables that destroy generational wealth are straightforward. Having many children means dividing assets more ways each generation. High spending relative to investment returns depletes principal. Divorce settlements split estates. Wealth taxes in high-tax jurisdictions claim portions of transfers. Poor investment choices or lack of financial sophistication among heirs leads to losses. Most wealthy families don't educate successive generations in wealth management, so heirs often lack the knowledge needed to preserve what they have inherited. But the current great wealth transfer is happening against a backdrop that differs from previous generational transitions in important ways. For one, today's younger generations face fundamentally different economic conditions than their parents did. Baby boomers entered the job market during decades of rising wages, affordable housing, and available pensions. They could work for one employer for 30 years, receive a pension that paid a percentage of their salary for life, and retire comfortably. That world no longer exists for most workers. Millennials and Gen Z entered adulthood during the Great Recession, faced skyrocketing education costs requiring massive student debt, and confront housing markets where prices have risen far faster than wages. The median home price relative to median income is at historic highs. A house that cost 3 times a household's annual income for a baby. Boomer might cost 8 or 10 times annual income for a millennial in the same market. Student loan debt has ballooned from something that affected a small minority to a nearly universal burden for college graduates. The average debt for recent graduates exceeds $30,000, with many owing far more. These different starting conditions mean inherited wealth serves different purposes across generations. For many millennials and Gen Z members, inheritance won't represent newfound wealth enabling luxury or investment. It will represent a chance to pay off debt, afford a home down payment, or catch up on retirement savings that should have been accumulating for years. Surveys show that 60% of expected inheritors plan to invest part of their inheritance, while 51% plan to use it to pay off debt. The money goes to repairing economic disadvantages rather than building new advantages. The investment behavior of younger generations also differs from their parents in ways that will shape how inherited wealth gets deployed. Bank of America research found that 72% of investors between ages 21 and 43 believe it's no longer possible to achieve above-average returns solely through traditional stocks and bonds. Only 28% of investors aged 44 and older share that belief. This skepticism about traditional investments drives younger inheritors toward alternative assets. 26% of younger investors say private equity offers the greatest growth opportunity compared to just 15% of older investors. Younger generations also prioritize environmental, social, and governance factors in investment decisions at much higher rates than older generations. 82% of respondents between ages 24 and 43 consider a company's ESG track record when making investment decisions, while only 41% of all respondents do. This suggests that as wealth transfers to younger hands, capital will increasingly flow toward companies and investments aligned with sustainability and social responsibility values. The shift could reshape corporate behavior as businesses compete for investment dollars, controlled by inheritors who care about more than just financial returns. Real estate remains the one investment category preferred similarly across generations, likely because housing represents both an investment and a basic need. But access to real estate investing differs dramatically by wealth level. Wealthy inheritors can buy investment properties, diversify geographically, and benefit from appreciation and rental income. Middle-class inheritors might afford one home. Poor inheritors remain locked out of home ownership entirely, unable to convert inheritance into the wealth-building vehicle that housing represents. The concentration of wealth in financial assets versus physical property has also shifted over the past century. Research examining long-term trends shows that aggregate wealth-to-income ratios were lower before World War I than previously thought, and that the composition of wealth has changed from being mainly held by the rich in the form of business assets and farmland to being mainly held by the middle class in the form of housing and pension savings. This democratization of wealth ownership partially explains why dramatic wealth equalization over the 20th century has not reversed despite rapidly increasing aggregate wealth-to-income ratios. More people own some wealth, even if the very wealthiest still own the most. But pension savings for younger workers look very different than for boomers. Traditional defined benefit pensions, which paid guaranteed monthly income for life, have largely disappeared outside government employment. They've been replaced by defined contribution plans like 401ks, which shift investment risk and longevity risk onto individual workers. A boomer with a pension knows they'll receive a certain amount every month until death. A millennial with a 401k has to manage investments, estimate how long they'll live, and calculate sustainable withdrawal rates. If they miscalculate or live longer than expected, they risk running out of money. The introduction of 401k plans and automatic enrollment features has actually helped some younger workers save more effectively than earlier generations. Research from Vanguard found that 45% of Gen Z workers are on track for adequate retirement savings, compared to 42% of millennials, 41% of Gen X, and 40% of baby boomers. The improvement comes partly from automatic enrollment in retirement plans and automatic contribution escalation over time. Employers enroll workers by default and gradually increase their contribution rates each year unless the worker opts out. This behavioral nudge overcomes inertia and procrastination that prevents many people from saving adequately. Time also favors younger workers. A Gen Z worker earning median income for their generation, about $27,000 annually, faces an estimated retirement shortfall of around $3,000 per year if they don't increase savings. A boomer earning their generation's median of $56,000 faces a $9,000 annual shortfall. The Gen Z worker has 40-plus years to adjust contributions and let compound interest work. The boomer has little time left. Even workers not currently on track can get there with relatively modest changes if they start early. But starting early requires not being buried under debt or struggling to afford basic living expenses. This is where inheritance can make a transformative difference. A young worker receiving even $20,000 or $30,000 that allows them to pay off high-interest debt or avoid taking on new debt in the first place gains enormous advantage. They can redirect what would have been debt payments into retirement contributions. Over decades, that shift can mean the difference between comfortable retirement and working until death. The great wealth transfer also raises questions about productive versus extractive uses of capital. When wealth concentrates in the hands of people who inherited it rather than earned it through work or entrepreneurship, does society benefit? Inherited wealth can fund new businesses, charitable causes, arts and culture, and other valuable activities. But it can also sit in financial assets, generating returns for owners who contribute nothing to the economy beyond their capital. The recipient of a $20 million inheritance can live comfortably on investment returns without working, creating, or producing anything. Some economists worry about the rise of what they call rentier capitalism, where returns to existing capital exceed returns to labor. If inherited wealth generates higher returns than working for a living, rational people will focus on marrying into wealth, preserving inherited wealth, or otherwise positioning themselves to benefit from capital rather than labor. This shifts societal focus from productive work to wealth extraction and can reduce economic dynamism. Historical research on secular cycles in civilizations, from Rome to medieval England to modern America, shows that when inequality rises to extreme levels, when wealth becomes too concentrated, societies typically experience periods of conflict and forced redistribution through revolution, war, or economic collapse. We may not be facing revolution, but the scale of inequality enabled by concentrated inheritance does create social tensions. Young people watching their peers inherit millions while they struggle to afford rent understandably feel the system is rigged. When hard work and education don't guarantee economic security, but having wealthy parents does, meritocratic ideals ring hollow. Research shows that recipients of family wealth help often downplay or rationalize the assistance to maintain their self-image as self-made. But this psychological accommodation doesn't change the structural reality that family wealth determines economic outcomes more than individual effort for a large and growing segment of the population. The question of what constitutes fair inheritance is culturally and politically fraught. Some argue that people should be free to give their wealth to whomever they choose, including their children, without government interference. Others argue that large inheritances perpetuate inequality and should be heavily taxed. The United States has an estate tax that applies to estates exceeding certain thresholds, currently about $13 million for individuals and double that for couples. But wealthy families employ sophisticated estate planning to minimize or eliminate these taxes through trusts, family foundations, strategic gifting during life, and other techniques. The result is that only a tiny fraction of estates pay any estate tax at all. Other countries take different approaches. Some European nations have higher inheritance taxes, but also more loopholes. Some have wealth taxes that chip away at large fortunes over time. Some have forced heirship rules, requiring that children receive certain portions of estates, regardless of parents' wishes. The diversity of approaches reflects different cultural values about family obligation, individual rights, and the role of government in managing inequality. What's clear is that $124 trillion changing hands over 25 years will reshape American society in fundamental ways. The recipients of this wealth, primarily millennials and Gen X, will become the dominant economic and political force. Their spending patterns, investment decisions, and policy preferences will determine economic trajectories for decades. Industries that serve their needs and values will thrive. Those that don't will struggle. Healthcare and eldercare industries will face massive demand as boomers age. The financial services industry will compete intensely to manage the wealth being transferred, knowing that whichever firms establish relationships with inheritors will control trillions in assets. Real estate markets will see surges in certain locations as newly wealthy inheritors buy homes. Charitable organizations will receive unprecedented gifts as $18 trillion flows to philanthropy, though that giving will concentrate in areas that wealthy donors prefer rather than necessarily where social needs are greatest. Political implications are harder to predict but likely significant. Will the generation inheriting this wealth become more conservative, more focused on protecting assets rather than redistributing wealth? Or will awareness of their own good fortune make them more supportive of policies that reduce inequality? Will they resent taxation of their inheritances, or will they accept higher taxes as legitimate? The answers will shape policy debates on everything from tax rates to social programs to climate change response. The transfer is already underway. The horizontal phase, where wealth moves between spouses, is happening now as older boomers die. The intergenerational phase is beginning and will accelerate over the next decade as the bulk of boomers reach their 80s. The children who inherit will themselves age into their 60s and 70s, and eventually they'll face their own wealth transfer decisions. The cycle continues, generation after generation, each shaped by the economic conditions they experience and the choices they make about how to use their inherited advantages or overcome their inherited disadvantages. For those expecting inheritance, the key questions are practical. How much will you actually receive, and when? What will you do with it? How can you make inherited wealth serve your goals rather than squandering it? For those not expecting inheritance, the questions are different but equally important. How can you build wealth without family help? How can you provide for your own children what you didn't receive? How do you compete in a system increasingly shaped by inherited advantage? The research suggests several lessons regardless of your position. Start saving early if you possibly can, even small amounts, because time is the most valuable asset in wealth building. Avoid high-interest debt that compounds against you rather than for you. Invest in education and skills that increase earning power. Build professional networks that create opportunities. Live below your means when possible to save the difference. Use inheritance strategically if you receive it, prioritizing debt reduction, home ownership, and retirement savings over consumption. For those giving inheritance, the lessons are different. Communicate openly with family about plans and expectations. Consider giving while you're alive so you can see the impact and provide guidance. Structure gifts to encourage productive use rather than dependence. Educate your children about money management before they inherit substantial sums. Consider charitable giving that aligns with your values. Plan for long-term care costs so medical bills don't consume the estate you hope to pass down. The great wealth transfer of $124 trillion is the largest in history, but it's not the last. Every generation will face this transition as those who accumulated wealth age and die. The patterns established now, the norms that develop around inheritance, and the policies that govern wealth transfer will shape these future transitions. We're living through a moment that will define economic reality for decades to come. Understanding what's happening, who benefits, and why it matters is essential for anyone trying to build financial security in an era when inheritance increasingly determines destiny. If you found this examination of the great wealth transfer valuable, If you now understand why these patterns matter and how they'll shape your future, regardless of whether you expect inheritance, then you're seeing the economic structure that most analysis ignores. These aren't just statistics about money changing hands. This is the mechanism determining who gets opportunity, who builds wealth, and who maintains economic security across generations. Subscribe if you want to understand the systems shaping your financial future, because these patterns repeat every generation in new forms. The transfer is happening now, and what you do with that knowledge might determine which side of the wealth divide you end up on.